Welcome to The Call, an exclusive conversation hosted by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. We're delighted you are able to join us. Please note the views of our guests today are not necessarily those of the Chamber, but we hope you will find those views as valuable as we do. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A at any time, and we'll address as many as we can after the interview. Let's get started. Good morning, and welcome to The Call, brought to you by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington. I'm your host, Jay Sapsford, and here is today's question of the moment. Is China in danger of a Japan-style deflationary spiral? China's economy is suffering. Growth has slowed, and the government has responded with a series of stimulus measures. Over the past month, Beijing has eased rates, cut housing regulations, offered help to local governments, and promised more stimulus spending perhaps as early as next week. Some are making comparisons to the Japanese government response to the struggles it had with its lost decades in the 90s and the aughts. Both economies had periods of stellar growth. Both economies had to transition to slower growth. And both represent a slowdown of somewhere around 6 percentage points, which is a shock to any economy. Perhaps the biggest challenge that Japan faced as a result of that shock was deflation. And China is now also reporting falling prices. But is China likely to struggle as much as Japan? With me now to help explain that risk is Stephen Roach, economist, senior fellow at Yale, and a former chairman for Morgan Stanley Asia. Stephen, welcome to The Call.
Thank you, Jay. Pleasure to be back with you.
I wonder if we could just start by asking a simple question. How bad is China's economic situation right now?
Well, this is the toughest period of economic performance since the Chinese economy began the reforms and opening up in the 1980s. The growth rate is still positive. The economy is still growing 4 to 5%. A number that we would be very envious of. But relative to the hyper speed of the past, it's a significant slowing, and it comes with a series of major problems, both short-term cyclical and longer-term structural. So this is a very challenging period for China.
Now, we've noticed that the deflation numbers are coming out. Having spent some time in Japan, that seems very worrisome, given that, when prices fall, you have pressure on profits, which has pressure on wages, which sucks demand out of the economy, and prices start to fall again. And all of this, of course, wreaks havoc on balance sheet. I wonder if China is going to be suffering the same fate in the months and years ahead that Japan suffered throughout that period of during the 90s.
Well, Japan, by my reckoning, had about 14 consecutive years of deflation. In China, this is the first year, so you certainly don't want to generalize. But the forces that created the deflation of for 14 years are very reminiscent of those which are now gripping China, mainly a debt-intensive asset bubble, property, in the case of China, property and equities, in the case of Japan. And that's a worrisome combination. And I think the thing that worries me the most, though, are the structural similarities between the two aging, low productivity growth economies.
Yeah, I want to get to that aging in just a minute, but let's talk about the response. I remember during the 90s and later on, the Japanese government did a lot of things, a lot of spending. I remember that the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had his 3 arrows. The first was monetary policy, the second was fiscal, and the third was structural reform, which was designed to help more consumption and a more consumer-led recovery. But they kind of failed at that third one, if I'm not mistaken. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, it was a great theory, and the way it is supposed to work is that the combination of monetary and fiscal stimulus was hoped to jumpstart the economy, create sort of what economists or space scientists would call the escape velocity from stagnation and deflation that would then be buttressed by the structural changes. Japan couldn't do that structural change largely because of political constraints on this one-party LDP-dominated a political system. And here's China all these years later with one party facing a different set of political issues, but really having a tough time producing the structural reforms that it needs to reinforce its own sort of three-arrow approach to economic revival.
So the similarities between Japan and China include this sort of targeted investment model of growth. And there seems to be a real difficulty making that transition from that model to one that is broader and more driven by consumption. And why is it so difficult?
Well, I think that's the biggest question that I have addressed in my own writing and speeches I've made, namely in China, around the world, on this problem. The consumer share of the Chinese economy is less than 40%. By comparison, the U.S., the number is in the mid to high 60s. And given the aging of the society and the need to worry about safety net expenses like healthcare and retirement, this is where China has fallen well short of what's required to convert consumers into active participants in society and the economy. So you can give them more income by jobs and moving from rural to urban areas, but they're going to still save it out of fear because of an inadequate social safety net.
Okay, if you've just joined us this morning, this is The Call, a regular video conversation in which we address the geopolitical issues of our time. Today, we are discussing China, Japan, and the risk of a deflationary spiral with longtime Asia economist and senior fellow at Yale, Stephen Roach. You know, it's very interesting. You were talking about the fears of the Chinese consumer. If I'm a 50-year-old Chinese person right now, I've got one child, that child is married, and they have to support four parents. In a country that lacks the sort of safety net that even Japan had for the elderly, my instincts are that I'm going to hang on to that money, particularly if prices are falling and two apples today are going to buy you, the price of two apples today will buy you three tomorrow. It just seems like it's it's going to be a real tough slog to try to get consumption reinvigorated.
Well, it has been and it will continue to be so unless the Chinese authorities really jump headlong into shocking these fear-driven, increasingly aging Chinese families and consumers. So I've been a big advocate of making the case that Beijing needs to inject a massive amount of stimulus money into the healthcare system, into the pension system, to convert fear into security. The Chinese population is declining right now. The working age population has been declining for nearly a decade. And so the clock is ticking here, and they need to do something quickly and with scale and with size to demonstrate their awareness of this problem.
Okay, one of our audience members is raising a question that I have as well. If this is unsuccessful, if they're unsuccessful in having sufficient demand from consumers to drive a recovery and keep the economy moving forward, what about trade? Are they going to try to export their way out of this trouble?
Well, that's a great question. In fact, that's exactly what they're doing right now. The government continues to emphasize its focus on what it calls new productive forces, which is, Chinese code words for investing and emphasizing state-of-the-art, high technology areas, especially in their manufacturing sector. The problem here, and this is a problem that Japan experienced in the 1980s, is that the rest of the world views that as a threat and is pushing back against this tired recipe of export-led growth from China. So, they can try it, but, good luck with that in this global climate.
Now, in Japan's case, aging contributed to the long period of stagnation. In China's case, aging is well underway. In fact, China's population is already declining. Last year, it lost 2 million people. This year, it's going to lose between 6 and 9 million people if all these forecasts are accurate. I'm just wondering how you anticipate both aging and declining population will play out in terms of China's economic prospects.
Well, I think the thing we know about demography is it's one of these challenges, one of these headwinds that is very difficult to change. The Chinese, to their credit, are trying to create incentives for women of childbearing age to have more children. And there's been a little bit of progress, but not nearly enough to alter the downtrend. The cost of child rearing is prohibitively expensive in China. And let's face it, this one-child policy has been in existence now for over 40 years, and the social norms have adapted, and families are used to having small families. So this is a very difficult set of circumstances to address.
So China is not the only country facing these demographic pressures. It's something that many countries around the world are suffering from right now.
Well, what we know is when the population, the working age population for any nation declines, there is an offset that can come from getting more output out of the existing workforce, and that's the economist's way of saying the answer is in productivity. But there's been an ominous shift in the structure of the Chinese economy away from what had been high productivity private sector economy companies, especially in the internet area, back toward the low productivity growth state-owned enterprises, and that remains a very important focus of Xi Jinping and his government. So the mix of the Chinese economy is tilted against the productivity offset that would be otherwise very important to deal with an aging society.
Before we move on from the aging, so one more question on that from one of our audience members. Will China consider immigration to address their demographic challenge?
Short answer is no. The Chinese government, again, is very similar to Japan. And Jay, from your long experience in Japan that foreign workers were never welcomed with open arms to deal with demographic issues in Japan in the 80s and the 90s as they were building, and that has not been the case since then. There is the response that the Chinese authorities rolled out earlier this summer by raising the retirement age, getting a little bit more work effort out of the existing workers, but the increases that they put through were tiny, and they're spread out over a long period of time. So, coming up with, sort of the magic elixir of more workers to deal with aging, either foreign or domestic, male, female, is proving to be very challenging for China.
You mentioned earlier the state-owned enterprises. In Japan's case, a lot of the problems during that long slump was on the balance sheets of banks and corporations. But it seems in China's case, you mentioned, the regional governments. What's the dynamic there?
Well, the fiscal arm of the Chinese policy authorities has always been dominated by the finances of the local governments. They're in charge of really boosting the credit that goes into supporting the property market, and the local government funding of the property market has really been ground zero for the property crisis that's now taken such a serious hold in China. Local governments are heavily indebted. Many of them would really not be solvent by Western standards of government finance, and the government is moving from the central level to inject more liquidity, more support to local governments. But you have to ask yourself, what are they trying to achieve here? If they want to restart a local government funded property boom, that's precisely the situation that got them into this problem in the first place.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When you look at the way Japan unfolded after it started suffering from the property market declines and the deflationary pressures, it was sort of like this long, slow ebbing of Japan's economic vitality. It went from the world's second largest company to something somewhere lower down the list. As you look forward for China, what is your prediction if they aren't able to get this right?
Well, the picture you paint of Japan is really interesting by comparison because Japan's lost decades began when Japan was a very well-off society, very advanced per capita incomes, uh, at significantly higher levels than
Mm.
those that are prevailing in China today. So some of the more outspoken internal critics of China, leading demographers, for example, have said that the risk for China is that we get old before we get rich.
Yes.
That's a fair point. They're entering into this period of potential stagnation by Chinese standards at a much lower standard of living per capita GDP.
Now, you mentioned earlier that some of the senior Chinese officials are sort of seeking your counsel on this. I wonder, what are they asking?
Well, I taught a couple of courses at Yale for a number of years, one about the Chinese economy, but I also taught a seminar called The Lessons of Japan. And they're very focused on this, and that's the good news.
Yes.
Back in it was May of 2016, there was a very famous interview that was published on the front page of their communist newspaper, the People's Daily, where an anonymous but very highly placed so-called authoritative person warned of a Japanese-like quagmire if China didn't get off this path of debt-intensive, asset-fueled growth. And that caused a huge amount of debate inside of China. And I started getting invited to give lectures on the lessons of Japan almost immediately after that. And I've given them almost every year since. And I gave a series of lectures on this problem just this past summer in Beijing.
Right. Well, I guess China, at the end of the day, is a huge economy. It's much bigger than Japan. It's got a lot of strengths. It's got a massive industrial base. And I suppose one of the biggest assets that it has is being able to learn from Japan's experience on this. Whether they act on it or not is really up to the leadership in China. But I wonder, that's my takeaway. What is your takeaway now as you look at the comparison between China today and Japan?
Well, I think you're right to speak about the potential of China to continue to grow at a rapid rate. There's still plenty of urbanization that needs to be done, although they've done the bulk of it. Um, there's still a big challenge on the productivity front, and we've talked about that. I think they need to rethink their approach to the private sector. And the rubber meets the road, though, in addressing these structural challenges with respect to underconsumption. If they can address that and really, put the full force of their policy arsenal to bringing down this unacceptably high level of household saving, then there's no telling where they can go. And finally, China's really got to deal with its role in the world, especially the building conflict with the United States,
Hmm.
which is hobbling its growth potential as well right now. So there's plenty they can do if they're really determined to move the needle and avoid the type of multiple lost decades of stagnation and deflation that unfortunately gripped Japan since the early 90s.
All right. Well, our audience has had their morning shot of informational espresso, so we'll leave it there and we'll move on to tackle the day. Let me thank Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow at Yale School of Law, former Chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you for your great questions and good to see you again.
It's good to see you as well. And if you'd like to reach out to our guest, please see his email under the resource bar at the bottom of your screen. A warm thank you to you, our members, for joining us today. If you have a theme that you would like us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us at the email on the screen, globalintel@uschamber.com. We are planning many shows in the coming weeks and months, and we welcome your suggestions and feedback. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.